The first thing I smelled wasn't the sterile, sharp tang of hospital antiseptic. It was the scent of my own fear, that metallic, copper-tasting hum in the back of my throat that usually only comes when a patient is crashing on my table. My name is Sarah Vance. I've spent 12 years as a trauma nurse, which means I know exactly what it sounds like when a life is unraveling. Usually, I'm the one holding the scissors. But when I opened my eyes in that recovery room, the unraveling was mine. The room was dim, the kind of heavy, artificial twilight they keep you in so the anesthesia doesn't shatter your senses. My right side felt like someone had driven a cooling iron through my ribs, a dull, rhythmic throb that kept pace with the beep of the monitor. But that wasn't what woke me. It was a vibration. A frantic, desperate buzzing against the metal bedside rail. My phone was dancing on the edge of the tray, its screen a blinding white rectangle in the gloom. I reached for it, and my arm felt like it was made of lead and static. My fingers fumbled, thick and useless, until I managed to press the screen. My heart didn't just skip, it felt like it hit a wall. 22 missed calls. The number wasn't saved in my contacts, but I recognized the area code. It was a local landline. Before I could even process the count, the phone shrieked again. I swiped the glass, my voice coming out as a dry, jagged rasp. Hello? Sarah? Oh, thank God. Sarah, it's Arthur Henderson. From next door. The panic in his voice acted like a shot of adrenaline, burned straight through the fog of the propofol. Arthur is 74. He's the kind of neighbor who mows his lawn in dress slacks and only calls if your trash can has blown over. He doesn't do panic. Arthur? What's happened? I'm still. I'm in the hospital. I just got out of surgery. Sarah, you need to listen to me. I'm at your house. Well, I'm at your parents' house, across the street. I was out checking the mail because the rain started coming down sideways, and I saw something. I saw movement on the porch. Sarah. Leo and Maya are here. They're alone. The monitor spiked. The beep 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 turned into a frantic, high-pitched chirrup. I tried to sit up, and a white-hot blade of pain sliced through my incision, pinning me back to the thin hospital mattress. What do you mean alone, Arthur? My parents. Eleanor and Ray, they're right there. They were supposed to stay until noon. My surgery ran over, but they were supposed to be there. They aren't here, Sarah. Their car has been gone for nearly 2 hours. I've been watching from my window, hoping they'd pull back in, but the kids. Leo was trying to use a stick to jemmy the front door lock. He's 6, Sarah. He was trying to get his sister inside because she was shivering. It's 45 degrees and pouring. I've got them in my kitchen now, wrapped in blankets, but they're terrified. Leo keeps saying his job was to keep Maya dry until you came back. Sarah, where are your parents? I couldn't breathe. The oxygen mask felt like it was suffocating me. I had handed my children, my heart, my breath, my entire reason for existing, to the 2 people who were supposed to be my foundation. I had vetted the schedule. I had printed the sheets. I had begged for just 4 hours of their time. And they had vanished. They had left a 6-year-old boy and a 4-year-old girl on a locked porch in a rainstorm as if they were nothing more than a couple of umbrellas left to dry. I didn't answer Arthur. I couldn't. I hung up and dialed my mother. My vision was tunneling, the edges of the room turning into a blurred, dark haze. She picked up on the second ring. And she sounded happy. The sound of my mother's voice was like a physical blow. It was light, melodic, and punctuated by the distant, high-end clinking of silverware against porcelain. It was the sound of a woman who didn't have a single care in the world, let alone the weight of 2 abandoned grandchildren on her conscience. Sarah. Sweetheart. You're awake. How did the procedure go? Did the surgeon say everything looked clean? I told your father that Dr. Eris was the best choice, didn't I, Ray? I listened to her for 5 seconds. In those 5 seconds, I felt the person I used to be, the reliable daughter, the one who always understood, the one who never made waves, die in that hospital bed. Where are my children, Eleanor? The silence on the other end was brief, a flickering hesitation that only someone who had spent 30 years studying her mother's manipulations would catch. Then, the pivot. The classic Eleanor Vance redirection. Oh, they're fine, honey. We had everything under control. But you'll never guess what happened. Maya, your sister, not the baby, called us in a total state. Absolute hysterics, Sarah. She had her final fitting for the gala tonight, and the seamstress had completely botched the hem. She was stranded at the boutique with no one to give her a second opinion, and you know how delicate she is about these things. She needed a witness. She needed support. You left them, I whispered. The words felt like shards of glass in my throat. You left a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old on a porch. In the rain. To go to a dress fitting. Now, don't be dramatic, she said, her voice sharpening, the maternal warmth replaced by that familiar, brittle coldness. We tucked them in for a nap. Your father checked the monitor twice. We were only going to be gone for 40 minutes, but the traffic was simply horrendous. Besides, we knew you'd be home soon. You're always so capable, Sarah. You always have been. You're the strong one. You don't need the hand-holding that your sister does. We knew you'd understand. Family helps family, right? Arthur Henderson has them, I said. My voice was no longer a rasp. It was a flat, dead line. He found them trying to break into your house to get out of the cold. Leo was trying to protect his sister because you weren't there. Well, thank goodness for Arthur then, she chirped, the lack of shame so profound it felt like a psychic tear. See? Everything worked out. No harm, no foul. We're just finishing up a quick celebratory lunch with Maya, she looks absolutely stunning in the emerald silk, by the way, and then we'll swing by and drop the kids off at your place. Just rest up, sweetheart. We'll see you later. She hung up. She actually hung up. I stared at the ceiling tiles. 4 water stains in the corner. I counted them again and again, trying to keep the world from spinning off its axis. For 32 years, that had been the script. Sarah is strong. Sarah is capable. Sarah doesn't need us like Maya does. I had built my entire identity on being the one who didn't need anything, thinking that if I were perfect enough, if I were low maintenance enough, I would finally earn a seat at the table. But sitting in that recovery room, feeling the pull of the stitches in my side and the cold hollow in my chest, I realized the truth. My strength wasn't a badge of honor to them. It was an excuse for their neglect. It was a permission slip for them to abandon me whenever something shinier, louder, or more demanding came along. They hadn't just left my kids on a porch, they had finally pushed me off the edge of the map. I didn't call the nurse. I didn't wait for my discharge papers. I threw my legs over the side of the bed, the pain flared like a white-hot sun, and I began to dress myself with shaking hands. I wasn't just Sarah the nurse anymore. I was a mother who had just seen the monster in the room, and the monster had her mother's face. The drive home was a blur of gray rain and gritted teeth. Every time I hit a pothole, my incision screamed, but it was nothing compared to the fire in my brain. I didn't go to my house first. I went to Arthur's. When I walked into his kitchen, still wearing my hospital ID bracelet and smelling of anesthesia, I saw them. Leo was sitting at the table, his small shoulders hunched, his knuckles white as he gripped a mug of cocoa. Maya was curled in a nest of borrowed towels on the floor, her thumb in her mouth, a habit she had broken a year ago. Leo looked up, and the expression on his face broke what was left of my heart. It wasn't relief. It was guilt. I tried, Mom, he whispered, his voice trembling. Grandpa said they'd be right back. He said I was the man of the house. I tried to get the door open, but I wasn't strong enough. Maya got cold. I'm sorry. I sank to the floor, ignoring the agony in my abdomen, and pulled them both into me. I held them until the shaking stopped, until the only sound was the rain hitting the window and Arthur's clock ticking on the wall. Arthur stood by the sink, his face a mask of grim understanding. He didn't ask what happened. He had lived across from my parents for 20 years. He knew. "I'm taking them home now, Arthur," I said, standing up with a ghost strength. "Sarah," he said softly. "What are you going to do?" I looked at my children, then back at the sage-green colonial across the street, the house I grew up in, the house that was supposed to be a sanctuary and had turned into a trap. "I'm going to do what I should have done a long time ago," I said. "I'm going to stop being capable." We walked across the street to my house. I didn't look at my parents' driveway. I didn't look for their car. I went straight to my kitchen, sat the kids down with a movie, and walked over to the junk drawer. I pulled out a heavy, black leather binder I usually use for tax documents. I emptied it onto the counter. I didn't cry. The time for tears had ended somewhere between the recovery room and the rain-slicked porch. This was about mechanics now. This was about structural integrity. My family was a house built on sand, and the tide had just come in. I sat at the table and opened my laptop. The blue light reflected in my eyes, cold and steady. I started a list. It wasn't a grocery list or a to-do list. It was an extraction plan. My fingers hovered over the keys, the pain in my side now a secondary concern to the cold precision taking over my mind. I clicked on the first bookmark, local locksmiths, 24/7 emergency service. I wasn't just changing the locks. I was changing the world. And as I hit the call button, I saw a flash of headlights in the driveway. My parents were home. They were laughing as they got out of the car, Maya's emerald dress bag draped over my father's arm like a trophy. They didn't even look toward my house. They didn't know that the Sarah they knew, the one who understood, the one who forgave, was already gone. And the woman who was left was about to become their worst nightmare. The headlights of my parents' car cut through the rain, sweeping across my living room wall like a searchlight. I watched from the shadows of the kitchen, my hand pressed hard against the surgical tape on my side. I heard the muffled sound of their laughter, that bright, easy sound that usually made me feel safe, but now sounded like a jagged blade scraping against bone. They didn't even glance at my windows. They didn't check to see if my lights were on. They simply walked into their house, carrying Maya's emerald dress like a holy relic, leaving the darkness to me. I turned back to the black binder on the counter. For 32 years, my life had been a series of entries in a ledger I never asked to keep. I was the strong one, a title given to me not as a compliment, but as a cage. It was a convenient label that allowed them to look past my needs, my exhaustion, and my life, because Sarah could always handle it. Maya was the delicate porcelain doll, I was the load-bearing wall. But they forgot one thing about load-bearing walls: if you stress them enough, if you ignore the cracks long enough, the entire structure doesn't just sag. It collapses. I opened the binder. It was empty, a void waiting to be filled with the new reality I was about to build. I started with a pen and a single sheet of paper, listing every ghosting I had endured. The time they skipped my nursing school graduation because Maya had a crisis with a boyfriend that turned out to be a 3-day drama. The way they forgot to mention the family vacation to the coast until they were already posting photos of the sunset, because they assumed I'd be too busy working the double shifts I took to pay off my student loans. The $50,000 loan they gave Maya for a boutique business that folded in 6 months, while they told me they just didn't have the liquidity when I asked for help with a down payment on a modest starter home. The list grew. It wasn't an act of bitterness, it was a clinical audit of a bankrupt relationship. I was looking at the debris of my own loyalty. Every time I had swallowed my pride, every time I had stayed late to organize a party I wasn't even a guest at, every time I had told myself, it's fine, it was all there, written in the black ink of a woman who was finally done lying to herself. My strength had been their greatest asset and my greatest liability. They had used my reliability as a silencer for my voice. The house was quiet, save for the rhythmic hum of the dishwasher and the soft, flickering light of the movie in the next room. Leo and Maya were asleep now, huddled together on the sofa, their breathing the only thing keeping me grounded. I looked at their small, innocent faces and felt a cold, terrifying clarity. If I stayed in this cycle, I was teaching them that this was love. I was teaching Leo that he had to be a man and protect his sister at 6 years old because the adults couldn't be bothered. I was teaching Maya that she was secondary to someone else's vanity. That was the moment that total extraction plan shifted from a thought to a mechanical necessity. I wasn't just angry anymore. I was a nurse in a triage unit, and the limb was too necrotic to save. You don't negotiate with a wound like that. You amputate. I reached for the phone and dialed the first number on my list. The silence of the night was about to be broken by the sound of a drill, and I was the one holding the blueprint for the demolition. The locksmith's van was a ghost-white shape in the driveway, its engine idling with a low, vibrating growl that seemed to echo the tension in my chest. It was nearly midnight. The rain had slowed to a miserable, freezing drizzle. Dale, the locksmith, stepped out into the light of the porch, his toolbox clanking with a heavy, metallic finality. He looked at me, pale, hunched over, still wearing my hospital wristband, and he didn't say a word. He'd seen this look before. It's the look of someone who has finally realized that the threat isn't coming from the outside, it's already got a key. Everything? He asked, his voice low and gravelly. Everything, I replied. Front door. Back door. The side gate. The garage. I want the old codes purged. I want the tumblers reset. If it has a hinge and it leads into this house, I want it deadbolted. The sound of the drill began, a high, piercing scream that tore through the quiet neighborhood. I stood on the porch, wrapped in a heavy cardigan, watching the sparks fly as the old locks were bored out. Across the street, my parents' house remained dark, but I knew Eleanor. She was a light sleeper. She was probably lying there, wondering what the noise was, assuming it was just another, capable, thing Sarah was doing in the middle of the night. Maybe a DIY project. Maybe more overtime. Each turn of the screwdriver felt like a stitch being pulled out of my old life. Turn. That was for the science fair I won alone. Turn. That was for the wedding they left early. Turn. That was for the rainy porch and the look in my son's eyes. I handed Dale a stack of cash. Money I had saved for a family vacation that would never happen now. As he handed me the new keys, they felt impossibly heavy in my palm. They were brass, sharp-edged, and gleaming. They represented a border. A sovereign territory where my parents' whims no longer held sway. Codes are reset, Dale said, packing his gear. The garage won't open with the old remotes. You'll have to sync the new ones yourself. Thank you, Dale. I walked back inside and locked the door behind me. The click of the deadbolt was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. It was a period at the end of a very long, very painful sentence. I walked through the house, testing every entrance. The side door, solid. The back slider, reinforced. I went to the garage and wiped the memory of the keypad, entering a sequence of numbers that meant nothing to them and everything to me. I looked at the black binder on the counter. Phase 1 was physical. Phase 2 was systemic. I sat down and pulled up the digital portal for the children's school. My parents were listed as primary emergency contacts. They had been there for years, a safety net that I now realized was made of cobwebs. I stared at the screen, my finger hovering over the delete button. For a second, the old Sarah, the good daughter, whispered that this was too much. That it was a bridge too far. But then I remembered Leo trying to jemmy a lock with a stick, and the whisper died. I clicked delete. Then I did it again. Eleanor Vance. Deleted. Ray Vance. Deleted. I replaced them with a name that actually meant something, Arthur Henderson. Then I added my sister-in-law, Claire, 3 states away. It was a long-distance backup, but she was a woman who actually answered her phone. The systemic erasure was beginning. I wasn't just changing the locks on my house, I was changing the locks on my children's lives. The light of the laptop screen felt like a cold fire. My eyes were burning, the exhaustion finally starting to seep into my bones, but the adrenaline wouldn't let me go. I had moved past the house. I had moved past the school. Now, I was moving into the deep tissue. I opened a folder on my desktop labeled Legal and Will. When Marcus and I had drafted our wills 3 years ago, we did what most people do, we chose the obvious path. My parents were the secondary guardians. They were the ones who would raise my children if the unthinkable happened. They were the ones who would manage the insurance money, the house, the legacy. I looked at the digital document, the names Eleanor and Ray Vance staring back at me in formal, legal font. It felt like a death warrant. If something happened to me tomorrow, my children wouldn't be raised by people who loved them. They would be raised by people who viewed them as an inconvenience to be managed between dress fittings and brunch. They would be raised to be capable and strong until they, too, were hollowed out by neglect. I didn't just need a change, I needed a total legal blackout. I drafted an email to my lawyer, a woman named Sandra who didn't take any nonsense. Subject, urgent, immediate codicil required. I told her I needed my parents removed from every medical proxy, every guardianship clause, and every financial directive. I wanted a no-contact clause regarding my medical decisions. If I ended up back in that hospital, incapacitated and fighting for my life, I did not want my mother to be the one deciding whether to pull the plug or not. I knew exactly how that would go. She'd check her social calendar before checking my vitals. I began scrolling through my social media feeds. It was a masochistic exercise, but I needed the fuel. I found it almost instantly. Maya had posted a reel. It was a high-definition, slow-motion shot of her and my mother in a boutique, clinking glasses of sparkling cider. The caption read, "Emergency glam sesh with the best mom in the world. What would I do without her support?" The timestamp was 1:45 p.m. At 1:45 p.m., I was in a recovery bay, struggling to breathe through the fog of anesthesia. At 1:45 p.m., my 6-year-old son was shivering on a porch, trying to figure out how to save his sister from the rain. And at 1:45 p.m., my mother was smiling into a camera, toasting to a hemline. I didn't feel rage. I felt a strange, terrifying calm. I screenshotted the post. I screenshotted the comments. I printed them out and hole-punched them, clicking them into the black binder with a rhythmic snap snap snap. This wasn't a scrapbook, it was a dossier. It was the evidence I would use when the inevitable storm arrived at my front door. I closed the binder and leaned back, the silence of the house pressing in on me. The total extraction was nearly complete. Physical access, revoked. School access, revoked. Legal guardianship, in progress. Digital ties, cut. I was a ghost in my own family tree, and I had never felt more alive. But as I went to close the laptop, a new notification popped up on the screen. It was an email from the school district, an automated alert that someone had just tried to log into the parent portal using my old password, a password my mother had borrowed months ago to look at the kids' school pictures. The notification wasn't just a warning. It was a sign that the silence was about to end. Eleanor was awake. And she was already looking for a way back in. I stared at the red "Login failed" notification on my screen. The glowing text felt like a heartbeat, pulsing with a warning I couldn't ignore. My mother wasn't just a casual observer of my life, she was a curator, and she had just realized she'd lost her VIP access. I sat there in the dark, the blue light of the laptop carving hollows into my face, and I realized that the erasure had to be absolute. If I left a single thread loose, she would find it and pull until my entire world unraveled again. I drove to Ridgeview Elementary the next morning before the first bell even rang. My side was a symphony of sharp, pulling pains, a reminder that my body was still trying to heal while my mind was at war. I walked through the main entrance, past the murals of suns and rainbows, feeling like an intruder in a place that used to represent safety. The air smelled of floor wax and pencil shavings, a scent that usually calmed me, but today it felt suffocating. Mrs. Holt, the school secretary, looked up from her desk. She'd known me for years. She'd seen me drop off cupcakes for Leo's birthday and band-aids for Maya's scraped knees. She saw the strong Sarah everyone else saw. But as I leaned against the counter, pale and bracing my hand against my ribs, she saw something else. She saw a woman who was done being polite. "I need to update the authorized pickup list," I said. My voice didn't shake. It was the voice I used when I had to tell a family their loved one wasn't coming home, flat, professional, and final. She pulled the yellow card from the file. I didn't just ask for a pen, I took it from her hand. I looked at the names. Eleanor Vance. Ray Vance. They were written in my own handwriting from a year ago, back when I still believed that grandmother was a title that carried the weight of protection. I drew a single, heavy line through both of them. I didn't just cross them out, I obliterated the names until the ink bled through the back of the card. "Everything all right, Sarah?" Mrs. Holt whispered. She was looking at the aggression of those black lines. She'd seen messy divorces and custody battles, but there was a specific kind of grief in watching a daughter strike her parents from the record. "They are no longer authorized," I said, looking her directly in the eyes. "Not for pickup. Not for emergency contact. Not for school plays or lunch visits. If they show up on this property, you call me. And if I don't answer, you call the police." I watched her eyes widen. The good daughter was dead. I filled out the new forms, adding Arthur Henderson and my sister-in-law, Claire. As I slid the card back across the counter, I felt a weight lift, but it was replaced by a cold, sharp dread. I was drawing a line in the dirt, and I knew Eleanor wouldn't just stay on her side of it. She would view this as a challenge, a personal insult to her brand of perfect motherhood. I walked back to my car, my breath hitching in my chest. The erasure was moving from the digital to the physical. As of 8:15 a.m., my parents were officially strangers to the institution that guarded my children for 8 hours a day. I sat in the driver's seat, clutching the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. One more wall built. One more door locked. But the hardest part wasn't the paperwork. It was the realization that every line I drew through their names was a funeral for the family I wished I had. The Victorian house on Main Street looked peaceful, its wraparound porch and hanging ferns suggesting a world where problems were solved over tea and quiet conversation. But inside, Sandra Klein was a shark in a silk blouse. She was the kind of lawyer who didn't just draft documents, she built fortresses. I sat in the leather chair across from her desk, the black binder resting on my lap like a weapon. "I need a total legal ghosting," I told her. Sandra didn't blink. She'd seen the fallout of 100 family wars. She watched as I opened the binder and showed her the screenshots, the emergency glam sesh, while my children sat on a rain-slicked porch. I didn't have to explain the pain. The timestamps did it for me. "I want them out of the will," I said. "Every penny, every asset. But more importantly, I want them out of the guardianship clause. If Marcus and I are gone, I want the children to go to Claire in North Carolina. I want a specific, notarized statement attached to the file explaining exactly why Eleanor and Ray Vance are unfit. I want their neglect documented in a way that no judge can ignore." The sound of Sandra's keyboard was a series of sharp, rhythmic clicks, the sound of my parents' influence being systematically dismantled. We moved on to the medical proxies. This was the one that made my blood run cold. Currently, if I were in a coma, my mother would be the one holding the pen. She would be the one deciding my fate. I thought about her clinking glasses at the boutique while I was under the knife. I knew exactly how she'd handle a life and death decision. She'd find a way to make it about her. "Remove them from the medical directive," I said. "If I'm incapacitated, Marcus is the primary. If he's not available, it's Arthur." I don't care if they are my biological parents. They are no longer authorized to speak for me. Sandra paused, her glasses sliding down her nose. You realize this is a scorched earth policy, Sarah? Once I file these codicils and send the notification letters to the banks and the hospital, there's no oops moment. This is a permanent severance. They severed it first, I said. They severed it when they turned their backs on a 6-year-old in a rainstorm. I'm just making the paperwork match the reality. I signed my name 6 times. 6 signatures to unwrite 32 years of history. I watched the notary press the seal into the paper, the heavy thump sounding like a gavel. I wasn't just a daughter anymore. I was a sovereign state, and I had just declared independence. I walked out of that office into the bright afternoon sun, feeling a strange, hollowed-out lightness. The legal blackout was in effect. My children were protected by the full weight of the law. My body was protected by a directive that forbade my mother from touching my life. But as I reached my car, I saw a familiar silver sedan idling at the end of the block. My father's car. He wasn't moving. He was just sitting there, watching me. He didn't wave. He didn't honk. He just waited. The legal walls were up, but the psychological war was only just beginning. I didn't look back at the silver sedan as I drove away, but I could feel it in my rearview mirror, a persistent shadow in the periphery of my life. I went home and did something I hadn't done in years. I went to Maya's Instagram profile. I didn't do it because I missed her, I did it because I needed to see the narrative they were constructing. The golden child had been busy. There were new photos from that morning. A shot of my mother, Eleanor, looking devastated, but brave, holding a cup of tea. The caption was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive martyrdom, praying for my sister today. Sometimes the people we love the most go through dark times and lash out at those who care. Family is everything, even when they don't want you there. The comments were a swarm of, oh, Eleanor is such a saint, and Sarah has always been so difficult. I felt a cold, hard knot form in my stomach. They weren't just neglecting me, they were weaponizing my silence. They were painting me as the unstable daughter, the capable woman who had finally snapped, while they played the role of the bewildered, grieving parents. I scrolled down further and found the photo I was looking for. It was from the day of my surgery. 1:30 p.m. The iced lattes. The marble table. The sunlight. I looked at the timestamp again, a silent witness to their betrayal. I didn't get angry. I got clinical. I took a screenshot of the St. Eleanor post and added it to the binder. I printed out the boutique photo again, this time in high resolution, and pinned it to the corkboard in my kitchen. This wasn't a family feud anymore. It was a court case. I sat at my table, the black binder open, the screenshots and school forms and legal codicils all laid out like a puzzle. I had changed the locks. I had purged the school list. I had rewritten my will. I had unfollowed the drama. I was a fortress. But fortresses are only useful if you know where the attack is coming from. I looked at my phone. I had 3 new voicemails. All from my father, Ray. The peacemaker. The man who had spent 40 years helping Eleanor bury her mistakes under a layer of, let's just move on. I didn't listen to them. I knew what they said without hearing a single word. Your mother is upset, Sarah. You're making a scene. Just come over for dinner and we'll talk. They didn't want to talk. They wanted me to resume my position as the load-bearing wall so they could continue to build their lives on top of me. But the wall had moved. I walked over to the front door and looked through the peephole. The street was empty now. The silver sedan was gone. But then, my eyes caught something on the porch. A small, white envelope had been slid under the door while I was in the kitchen. I picked it up. No stamp. No return address. Just my name written in my mother's perfect, elegant cursive. I opened it, my heart hammering against my ribs. Inside was a single photograph. It wasn't a new one. It was a photo of me as a child, maybe 5 years old, holding my mother's hand. But someone had taken a red pen and drawn a circle around my hand, and next to it, a single word was written in that same elegant script. Ungrateful. I stared at the word, and for the first time since I woke up from surgery, I felt a genuine chill that had nothing to do with the rain. They weren't going away. They were settling in for a siege. And as I looked at the photo, I realized that the big reveal wasn't just about what they had done to me, it was about what they were prepared to do next. My phone buzzed in my hand. A text from an unknown number. "We're coming over, Sarah. We need to discuss the children's future. Don't bother locking the door." The text sat on my screen like a physical weight, cold and immovable. Don't bother locking the door. It was a classic Eleanor Vance move, the kind of psychological gaslighting that assumes her authority is a law of nature, a force that doesn't require a key because it owns the room by divine right. She wasn't just coming over for a talk, she was coming to reclaim her territory. She was coming to show me that my boundaries were just sandcastles in the face of her tide. I looked at the clock. 5:15 p.m. Sunday. The exact time the family reconciliation dinner was supposed to start. The ritual they used to smooth over every bruise and silence every scream. For years, I had been the one roasting the chicken, setting the table, and preparing the apologies I didn't owe. But today, the oven was cold. David, my husband, walked into the kitchen. He had caught the first flight back from his conference, canceling his keynote presentation the moment I told him about the porch. He didn't ask questions. He didn't tell me I was being dramatic. He just walked over to the counter and looked at the black binder, the war room, as he'd started calling it. He saw the ungrateful photo, the screenshots of the boutique brunch, and the newly signed legal codicils. He didn't look at the papers with judgment. He looked at them with a grim, protective pride. He had spent 10 years watching me shrink myself to fit into the corners of my mother's life. He had been the one keeping score on my behalf because he knew I had stopped counting a long time ago. He reached out and placed his hand over mine, his grip steady and warm against my ice-cold skin. "I'm proud of you, Sarah," he said. 4 words. 4 simple words that carried more weight than 30 years of my mother's "proud of you always" cards. You aren't making waves. You're finally stopping the storm. They're coming, I whispered. They think they still have a seat at this table. They think they can just walk through that door and reset the clock. Let them try, David said. He looked toward the hallway where the children were playing. But they aren't getting past me. And they aren't getting past you. I walked over to the side table by the coat rack and picked up the binder. It was heavy now, a physical record of their obsolescence. I didn't want to hide it. I wanted it to be the first thing they saw. I placed it on the small table right next to the door, positioned perfectly under the hallway light. Beside it, I placed the bowl of new keys, brass, gleaming, and sharp. The silence in the house was absolute, the kind of stillness that precedes a massive atmospheric shift. I stood in the frame of the living room, my white blouse buttoned to the chin, my hair pulled back into a tight, severe knot. I wasn't the daughter who absorbed and forgave anymore. I was a sentry. I was the final gatekeeper of my children's safety. And as the sound of a car engine vibrated through the floorboards, I felt my heart hammer against my ribs, not with fear, but with the steady, rhythmic beat of a war drum. The headlights of the silver Camry swept across the front window, followed by the low, idling hum of Maya's red Civic. They had come in a convoy. A show of force. I stood perfectly still, watching the shadows of 3 people move across the frosted glass of the front door. I heard the sound first. It was the familiar, rhythmic jingle of my mother's keychain, the one with the silver E and the miniature Eiffel Tower. Then, the scraping sound of metal against metal. She didn't knock. She didn't ring the bell. She simply stepped onto the porch and slid her old key into the lock. I watched the handle jiggle. I heard her breath hitch in a moment of confusion. She tried again, more forcefully this time, the key grinding uselessly against the new tumblers Dale had installed. Ray? This isn't, the lock is stuck, I heard her say through the wood. Her voice was thin, rising with a hint of irritation. I heard my father's heavier footsteps. Let me try, Eleanor. You're probably just turning it the wrong way. The handle rattled violently now. I could imagine him leaning his shoulder into the door, the peacemaker, trying to force his way into a room he no longer had a right to enter. The jiggling turned into a rhythmic thudding. Then, silence. Sarah? It was Maya's voice now, sharp and entitled. Sarah, open the door. It's freezing out here and we have the roast. Just open up, this isn't funny. I waited. I counted to 5, letting the silence of the house answer for me. I wanted them to feel the weight of that locked door. I wanted them to understand that the capable Sarah, who used to run to the door the moment she heard their tires on the gravel, was gone. Ring the bell, Ray, Eleanor hissed. The chime echoed through the hallway, a bright, artificial sound that felt like an intrusion. I didn't move. I let it ring 3 times, the sound layering over itself until it became a physical pressure in the air. Only then did I step forward. I didn't rush. I walked with a slow, deliberate pace, my hand reaching for the new deadbolt. I turned the thumb turn. Click. A clean, metallic sound that signaled the end of an era. I opened the door, but I didn't step back. I stood in the center of the frame, my shoulders square, my gaze level. Eleanor was standing there, a glass baking dish cradled in her arm, the steam from the pot roast fogging up her glasses. Ray was behind her, looking down at the key in his hand as if it had betrayed him. Maya was on the walkway, her arms crossed, her emerald dress bag draped over her shoulder like a cape. The key doesn't work, Eleanor said. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. She looked at me, her face already beginning to crumple into that performative mask of hurt she used to win every argument. Sarah. Why doesn't the key work? Because the locks have been changed, I said. My voice was a flat, dead line. And they weren't changed for a DIY project, Eleanor. They were changed because you don't live here. And you aren't welcome here. The pot roast dish tilted slightly in her hand. For a second, the script was broken. She didn't know the lines for this scene. She looked at the door, then at me, then at the black binder sitting on the table just behind me. She could see the edge of the school form, the black ink of her name crossed out in a violent, permanent strike. Sarah, don't be absurd, Ray said, stepping forward with his negotiation voice. It was one afternoon. One mistake. We brought dinner. Let's just go inside, sit down, and move past this drama. Maya's vanity over my children's lives. And now, I'm making a choice, too. You're being dramatic, Maya snapped from the walkway. They were fine. Mrs. Doyle was right there. You're just looking for a reason to be the victim for once. I looked at Maya. The golden child. The one whose needs had been the sun our family orbited for 3 decades. I didn't feel anger toward her anymore. I felt pity. She had been raised to believe she was the only person in the room, and she had no idea that the room was currently collapsing. I'm not the victim, Maya, I said. I'm the audit. And your account is overdrawn. I opened the binder. I pulled out the first page, the photo of the boutique brunch. I held it up so the porch light hit it. 1:30 p.m., I said. This is you clinking glasses while my son was trying to jemmy a lock with a stick to keep his sister from shaking. Do you want to see the school forms next? Or the new will? Eleanor's face shifted. The hurt mother mask slipped, and for a split second, I saw the rage underneath. The fury of a woman who had just realized she no longer controlled the narrative. You can't do this, she whispered, her voice trembling. I am your mother. I gave you life. And you almost took mine, I replied. By making me believe that your love was something I had to earn by being invisible. But I'm not invisible anymore, Eleanor. I'm the only thing standing between you and my children. And I'm telling you to leave. We aren't leaving until we see our grandchildren, Ray said, his voice hardening. He tried to step over the threshold, his hand reaching for the doorframe. I didn't flinch. I didn't step back. I looked past them, into the kitchen where Leo was sitting at the table. He had stopped drawing. He was staring at the front door, his eyes wide, his small hands gripped around a blue crayon. He had heard the voices. He had heard the thudding on the door. Leo, I called out, my voice steady. Bring me your drawing, honey. Leo walked down the hallway, his steps hesitant. He didn't look at his grandparents. He looked only at me. He handed me the piece of paper, the square house with the triangle roof. He had finished it. There were 4 stick figures inside the house, me, David, Leo, and Maya. And there, off to the far right, separated by a thick black line he'd drawn with a marker, were 2 figures standing in the rain. He had written a word next to them in careful, crooked letters. It wasn't Grandma or Grandpa. I turned the drawing around and held it up to the glass. Eleanor leaned in, her eyes scanning the paper. She saw the figures in the rain. She saw the black line. And then she saw the word my 7-year-old son had used to describe the people who had left him on a porch. The word wasn't a name. It was an epithet. And as Eleanor read it, the glass dish in her hand began to shake so violently that the gravy sloshed against the foil, a dark, greasy stain spreading across her expensive wool coat. She looked from the drawing to Leo, and for the first time in 32 years, I saw my mother realize that she wasn't the hero of this story. She was the villain in a 7-year-old's memory. Sarah, she gasped, her voice breaking. You told him, you made him think. I didn't have to tell him anything, I said. He was there. He felt the cold. He felt the fear. He's the one who decided where you belong in this house. I began to close the door. It was a slow, heavy movement, the weight of the oak feeling like the closing of a tomb. Wait! Ray shouted, shoving his foot into the gap. You can't just cut us off. We have rights. We'll take this to court. We'll tell them you're unstable, that the surgery affected your head. Go ahead, I said, leaning in close so only he could hear me. I've already filed the affidavits with Sandra Klein. I've documented every crisis Maya has had that you prioritized over my kids. I have the timestamps. I have the witness statement from Arthur Henderson. If you want to go to court, Ray, we can go. But you won't just lose the kids. You'll lose everything. Because I'm not the capable Sarah you can bully anymore. I'm the nurse who's been charting your neglect for a decade. And my notes are perfect. I pushed the door. His foot slid back, the threat of the legal binder and the cold steel in my eyes finally breaking through his delusion. The door shut. Click. The deadbolt slid home. Thump. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood, my eyes closed, my breath coming in jagged gasps. I heard them on the porch. I heard the muffled shouting, the sound of the glass dish being set down on the stone, and finally, the retreating footsteps. 3 car doors slammed. 2 engines started. The gravel crunched as they backed out of the driveway, fleeing the house that was no longer theirs. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the heavy, expectant silence of a siege. It was the quiet of a house that had finally been cleared of its ghosts. David walked up behind me and put his arms around me. I let the binder slip from my fingers, hitting the floor with a dull thud. I turned around and buried my face in his chest, the tears finally coming, not tears of grief, but of a terrifying, beautiful freedom. It's over, he whispered. No, I said, looking over his shoulder at Leo, who was already heading back to the table to start a new drawing. It's just beginning. I walked back into the kitchen, the adrenaline finally fading, leaving me with the bone-deep ache of my recovery. I looked at the corkboard, at the high-res photo of the boutique brunch. I reached up and pulled it down, crumpling it into a ball and dropping it into the trash. I sat down next to Leo. He looked up at me, his expression unreadable for a moment, then he leaned over and whispered something in my ear that made the breath catch in my throat. It wasn't about the rain. It wasn't about the porch. It was about the white envelope my mother had slid under the door, the one with the ungrateful photo. Because as I looked at the trash can, I realized the envelope was gone. And then I saw the light flickering in the backyard. I stood up and walked to the window. Through the glass, I saw a small, orange glow in the center of the fire pit. My daughter, Maya, was standing there in her rain boots, holding a long stick. She was watching a piece of paper curl into ash. And as the flames flared up, I realized it wasn't just the photo she was burning. She was holding something else. A second envelope, one I hadn't seen. One that had been tucked inside the first. I pushed open the back door, the cold air hitting my face. Maya? What is that? She didn't look up. She just pointed the stick at the dying embers. Grandma left a map, Mommy. She said it was a surprise. She said it shows where the real family is staying. I looked into the fire. The paper was almost gone, but I could still make out a hand-drawn diagram of a location I didn't recognize. A cabin in the woods, 3 hours north. And written across the bottom, in that same elegant cursive, were 5 words that turned my blood to ice. We'll see them there soon. The cold from the open door didn't just touch my skin, it sank into the marrow of my bones. I stared at the blackened, curling remains of the paper in the fire pit. We'll see them there soon. It wasn't a map to a vacation home. It was a manifesto of obsession. Eleanor didn't see my children as people. She saw them as assets in a bankruptcy trial she refused to lose. She had been planning a secondary life, a real family retreat, while I was still on the operating table. I reached into the embers with a pair of metal tongs, pulling the last unburned corner of the map from the heat. My hands were shaking, but not from the chill. I looked at Maya, standing there in her rain boots, her face illuminated by the flickering orange glow. She was only 4. She didn't understand that the surprise her grandmother had whispered about was a kidnapping dressed in the robes of a family outing. Maya, honey, I said, my voice tight and controlled, go inside to Daddy. Right now. She looked at me, her eyes reflecting the dying fire, then turned and ran toward the house. I stood in the dark, the smell of wood smoke and burnt ink filling my lungs. I looked at the fragment in my hand. It showed a trail name, Spirit Lake. It was a remote area near the border, a place where cell service went to die and where my parents had spent their summers 40 years ago. It was a place of isolation. I walked back into the kitchen and slammed the door, locking it with a force that made the glass rattle. David was already there, holding Maya. He saw the look on my face. He saw the charred scrap of paper in my hand. He didn't have to ask. He saw the war room binder on the floor and the ungrateful photo in the trash. He knew the siege hadn't ended with the car doors slamming in the driveway. It had just moved to a new front. They aren't going to stop, David, I whispered, my voice cracking for the first time. She's not grieving. She's hunting. She thinks she can just reset the family in the woods. Like we're just characters she can move to a different set. David's face went hard, his jaw setting in a way I'd only seen once before, the day he found out his own father had lied to him. He walked over to the closet and pulled out his heavy coat. They aren't hunting anyone, he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Because we're going to the one place Eleanor doesn't think we have the stomach to go. We're going to the police, Sarah. Not for a report. For an injunction. I looked at the binder. The screenshots. The timestamps. The school forms. The ungrateful photo. I had spent 32 years building a case I never wanted to win. I had the evidence. I had the motive. And as I looked at my children, huddled together on the sofa, I realized that capable Sarah was finally ready to do the most capable thing of all. I was going to burn the bridge while they were still standing on it. The lights of the precinct were a harsh, flickering blue against the wet pavement. I sat in the plastic chair, the black binder resting on my lap like a lead weight. The officer across from me, a man named Miller who looked like he'd seen too many family tragedies to be surprised by another, pushed a glass of water toward me. He didn't look at me like a strong woman. He looked at me like a witness. "Let's go through it again, Mrs. Vance," he said, his pen hovering over a notepad. "You're saying your parents abandoned your children on a porch for over 3 hours while you were in surgery? And that they've now left a note implying they intend to take them to a remote location?" I didn't just tell him. I showed him. I opened the binder. I laid out the emergency glam sesh photo next to the neighbor's witness statement. I showed him the timestamped text from my father, "Don't bother locking the door." I showed him the ungrateful photo with the red circle. And finally, I laid down the charred corner of the map Maya had tried to burn. "This isn't a misunderstanding, officer," I said. My voice was steady, the nurse in me taking over. "This is a pattern of psychological escalation. My mother doesn't see a boundary, she sees a challenge. She's already tried to bypass my school security. She's already entered my property to leave a threatening note. I am not here for a family dispute report. I am here for an emergency order of protection." Miller looked at the boutique photo, my mother smiling with a latte while my son shivered. He looked at the drawing Leo had made of the people in the rain. He stayed silent for a long time, the only sound the hum of the precinct's fluorescent lights. Then, he looked up at me. "You're a nurse at Ridgeview, aren't you?" "I am." "I've seen you in the ER, he said, his voice softening. "You're the one who keeps the families calm when things go south. You're the one who charts everything until there isn't a single question left." "I chart for the truth," I said. "And the truth is that my children are not safe as long as Eleanor and Ray Vance believe they have a right to them." He nodded and stood up. "Stay here. I'm going to get a sergeant. We're going to file for a temporary restraining order. Based on the abandonment and the subsequent threats, we can get a judge to sign off by morning. But Sarah, you know what this means, right? Once this is served, the family is over. There's no coming back from a police-enforced barrier." I looked at the black binder. I thought about 32 years of being the person nobody worried about. I thought about the "proud of you always" cards that were really just receipts for my silence. I thought about Leo making a peanut butter sandwich for his sister because the adults had left to get their hair done. "The family died on that porch, officer," I said. "I'm just here to make sure they don't take my kids to the funeral." We walked out of the precinct at 3 a.m. The air was crisp, the rain finally gone, leaving the world looking sharp and cold. David held my hand as we walked to the car. We didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. The walls were up. The law was involved. The extraction was complete. We drove home in silence, the streetlights flickering past like the moments of my old life, meaningless and fading. When we pulled into the driveway, I looked across the street. My parents' house was dark. The silver Camry was gone. Maya's red Civic was gone. They had already left for the Spirit Lake cabin, thinking they were winning a game I had stopped playing hours ago. I walked into my house and locked the door. Click. The sound didn't just mean, "stay out." It meant, "I am home." I went into the children's room. They were asleep, tangled in their blankets, safe in the fortress I had built with my own hands. I sat on the edge of Leo's bed and watched him breathe. He looked so small. So fragile. And yet, he was the one who had drawn the line. He was the one who had shown me that being strong didn't mean carrying everyone else's weight, it meant having the courage to put it down. I walked back into the kitchen and sat at the table. The black binder was closed. The war room was quiet. I picked up my phone and did the last thing on my list. I went to my mother's contact. I didn't block her. I didn't delete her. I renamed her. I typed in a single word, stranger. Then, I went to my social media. I didn't post a brave photo. I didn't write a passive-aggressive quote. I simply hit delete account. I watched the screen go dark. I watched my digital shadow vanish. I was no longer a character in Eleanor's play. I was no longer a witness to Maya's vanity. I was just Sarah. A mother. A wife. A woman who had finally learned that the most important job I ever had wasn't being capable, it was being present for the people who actually showed up. I looked out the window as the sun began to peek over the horizon. The sage-green colonial across the street looked smaller now. Less imposing. Just a house made of wood and paint, inhabited by people who had spent a lifetime building a facade that had finally crumbled. David came into the kitchen and put a cup of coffee in front of me. He didn't say anything. He just sat down and took my hand. We watched the light fill the room, a slow, golden tide that washed away the shadows of the week. "They'll get the order at the cabin," David said softly. "The sheriff up there is already briefed." "I know," I said. I took a sip of the coffee. It was warm. Real. I looked at the empty chair where my mother used to sit during Sunday dinners, the chair she used to occupy while she told me how strong I was so she didn't have to be. I didn't feel a hole there. I didn't feel a void. I felt space. Space for a new ritual. Space for a family that didn't require a ledger. Leo ran into the room, his hair messy, his dinosaur pajamas mismatched. He jumped into my lap, burying his face in my neck. "Mommy," he whispered. "Is the rain over?" I wrapped my arms around him, holding him so tight I could feel his heartbeat against mine. I thought about the porch. I thought about the surgery. I thought about the 32 years it took me to earn this moment. "The rain is over, baby," I said, a single tear finally escaping and tracing a path down my cheek. Not for what I'd lost, but for what I'd saved. It's a beautiful day. And for the first time in my life, we don't have to go anywhere at all. I looked at David. I looked at my son. And as my daughter came running in, wearing her rain boots even though the sun was shining, I realized that the hardest thing wasn't leaving the people who didn't love me right. The hardest thing was finally believing that I was worth the effort to stay for. 4 plates. No extra seats. No place setting for someone who might cancel. We were enough. We had always been enough. And as I closed my eyes and listened to the sound of my children's laughter, I finally felt the weight of the strong one lift off my shoulders, floating away like ash in the wind.
Have a story like this? Send it to us, and we'll share it with the world. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more true family drama. Thanks for watching.